Felix's eyelids scraped open with a couple of eyelashes still stuck together at the corners. He spent a few moments looking around to get his bearings and concluded he was home, in bed. Well, that's no fucking good, he thought. Mornings were always the hardest. His muscles were still tense from a night of thrashing, and his feet felt like he was wearing boots a few sizes too small, even though he was barefoot. He rubbed his face and groaned. His hands were gritty and sticky against his morning scruff. He gave them a confused look, but with the sun just rising, even with his window wide open, there was barely enough light to see how dirty they were. He threw back the covers and realized he was mostly covered in dried mud. God fucking damn it! He lived alone, so there was no one to worry about waking up. He rolled out of the filthy sheets and stood up. The mud caked to his body hair was pulling it any time he moved. This was not a problem that was getting ignored until he made breakfast. He walked gingerly into the darker rooms of his cabin, hair pulling and screaming with every step. He checked the fire in his wood stove. Still coals. He placed a few logs on and left the door open to breathe while he went to the kitchen to fetch a large pot. He dipped the heavy homemade vessel into his water barrel and scooped up just enough to bathe. It scraped the bottom, and he made note that he'd have to make the trip to get some more if it didn't start raining again soon. He let the pot drip over the barrel for a minute. Waste not, he thought. Navigation of his little dwelling got easier as the fire became a little more lively and the fresh logs caught. He placed the pan on the top of the stove and closed the loading door to control the burn. The cabin grew darker again. He shuffled back to the kitchen, which was dangerous knowing how splintery his floor could get when it was dry out. He didn't have the energy to lift his feet all the way yet, so he risked it. Mornings were always the hardest. He pulled a mason jar down from the shelf above his cutting board and sprinkled some of the aromatic black grounds into his mug. A scoop of water from the barrel was added on his way back to the stove. He placed the black metal cup with a wooden handle onto the quickly warming stovetop next to his bath water. He stuck a finger in the pan even though he knew what it was going to be. Cold. He sighed and used the water to wash his hands at least. It wasn't much scrubbing before he couldn't feel the texture on his skin anymore, and he decided that was good enough. He shook them dry and then waved them around in the air before holding them close to the fire. Once he deemed them dry enough, he picked up his tobacco pouch and fished around inside. Plenty of papers, and the leather pouch had kept his smoke moist. He pinched a couple of sprigs into a paper and deftly packed and rolled himself a cigarette. He was licking the paper as he walked out his front door. The trees across his field were still shadows on the horizon. They formed a black picket fence with their silhouettes. The sky was silver and gray with some darker spots where the sun wouldn't penetrate even if you asked real nice. Every few minutes, it spit some drops on him. He put his smoke on the railing of his porch and he casually went inside. No more than a minute later, he emerged with his water barrel in front of him while he walked over to the water spout. He walked back over to his cigarette, picked it up, blew the ash off, and pulled a long drag off it. As he exhaled, he gently pulled up a couple strings of tobacco off his tongue and lips and rubbed his fingers together until he felt the tobacco ball up and fall off. The crows were quiet this morning, he noted. Usually, there will be a few picking their way through the field. It's still too dark to see if they're out there, but frequently he can hear them before they're seen. He turned back to go inside while rolling the cherry out of his smoke and stepping on it with his calloused foot. As he pivoted, his hip popped uncomfortably and he limped back inside, grumbling incoherently to himself. Mornings were always the hardest. He grabbed the bath water off the stove and made his way to the large metal tub he used to bathe. There was a bar of soap stuck to the floor of it, and he poured the lukewarm water in slowly so that it would dislodge a little. The bath was far from warm, but he was too tired of being mudded up. Before he got in, he grabbed his cup of coffee and set it on the floor next to his stiff-bristled brush. The coffee was warmer than the bath, thank God. A couple sips of coffee, and it was time to get to business. He stepped into the tub and let his feet find the soap in the tepid water. Once he had that sorted, and wasn't going to sit on it, he lowered himself in. The water was still cold enough to make his testicles shrink up when they hit the surface. With a quick motion, he settled into the squat he had to maintain while he washed. He used the brush to dip into the water and started scrubbing the dirt free from his face. Slowly, he moved his way down his body, scrubbing lightly but thoroughly. He discovered a few new wounds while he was cleaning, nothing profound, but they were fresh enough to sting. His back and arms were laced with scars of varying sizes. Soon, these cuts too would join the static smattering of white tissue across his body. He stopped and reached down to grab his mug. The sun was rising enough to start lighting his bath time, and as he raised the mug to his lips, he kept them fairly tight to strain out the grounds. He furrowed his brow as he started to think. If it had been so long since rain, how did he get covered in mud? There wasn't so much as a puddle on the 67.5 acres of his farm right now. The sun got behind a lighter cloud, and it lit the world a bit more. Felix looked down at the bathwater and realized he was sitting in a pool of gritty blood. The red now obvious that it was wet again. "Ah, fuck," he said quietly. He slowly rose and swigged his coffee, grounds and all. Today was not going to be a great day. The sky released and the sound of rain on his roof roared. Looking at the wounds on his arms, this blood wasn't mostly his. Stepping out of the tub, he lifted it by the handles and carried it outside. The torrents from the sky rinsed his body and sent tendrils of blood down his legs where they spread out and drained between the boards of his porch. He tossed the bathwater over the railing where the ground gulped it up. He ran his fingers through his hair and shook the dirt out of it while the rain washed away what wasn't him. Well, he thought aloud, I better assess the damages. He stepped back inside, dripping from the rain, and shook his body a bit to dry off. Walking back into his room, he closed his window, which was letting in a considerable amount of rain, and looked around for his pants. Finding some, he pulled them over his wet skin. He didn't bother with a shirt since he was just going outside again, but he did find a strap of leather to tie his hair back and out of his eyes. With that, he strode out of his room, added 2 logs to the fire, and left it open. Outside, he walked to the back of his home and pulled open the dilapidated ruins of a cellar door. Soon after, the rain slowed. Down 6 stairs made of halved logs, each with multiple deep scratches, he entered the main area. It stunk of blood and feces. He found the lantern hung where it normally is, and lit it with a match from the tobacco pouch in his pocket. His eyes adjusted slowly to the now brighter light. Fully ready to have to butcher the tattered remains of a sheep, his stomach sank when he saw the remains of a woman. Now it seemed that time was of the essence. Pausing only for a minute to gather his thoughts, Felix began to take action. He walked to the pole in the center of the room with the shackles attached to the iron straps he had affixed to it. The shackles were split widthwise. They laid bare the hidden cracks he hadn't seen. Cracks from shoddy workmanship, he supposed. But none of that mattered now. Using the axe from the corner of the room, he swung several times into the support until it was wildly unsafe. The whole building groaned above him from having its very spine damaged so. He tossed the axe back into the corner and scooped up the remains of the woman. He couldn't recognize her from sight, but she smelled familiar. He closed the cellar door behind him and carried her around and into the house proper, sitting her down on the floor near his stove as if to warm her. He gathered some small items from his room and tied his boots together and slung them over his shoulder. He spread his lamp oil along the floor near her and the stove and pulled a log out of the fire. Casually, he placed it in the oil and immediately the fire began. He hoped they might think it was lightning, but truly didn't care. He would be gone before they came to notice. Kneeling, he spoke a soft apology to the victim of his beast. She didn't deserve this fate, and neither did he. He supposed that's why they called it a curse, and stepped out into the drizzle. Mornings are always the hardest.